All right, Auto 2, we're going to be beginning the part 2 of engine fundamentals. This part 2 has to do with the top end of the engine, which is the valve train, cylinder head and valve train components, including camshafts, etc. So let's go ahead and get started. So the cylinder heads, valves, camshaft, and related parts are what we consider to be the top end components. And obviously, like it says there on the screen, these control the flow of air and fuel into the cylinders and exhaust out. And most of the time as we go through this, we're talking about non-direct injected engines, although they could be direct injected. It's just that it's new enough that I'm still pretty much talking about indirect injection as we go through. And yes, I know we're talking about engine components, but because the injectors are mounted into the combustion chamber, it would be something to consider here. So the top end, like you see here, is in the combustion chamber, the valves and everything letting the air and fuel in and the exhaust out. And this is just a poor picture of an intake stroke, but the red is supposed to be air and fuel swirling down through into the cylinder, etc. Intake valve obviously being opened. So here's a picture of an old school 4-cylinder pushrod engine. You can see the pushrods here and the lifters, so we know it's an older engine. It's non-overhead cam's down inside the block. So this would be, gosh, everything up until at least domestic up until the early 90s, and foreign all the way to 2000 if you're talking about a Honda. Okay, so here's our 11th component of the whole PowerPoint, first top end component, which is the cylinder head. And this cylinder head, which bolts to the top of the block, happens to be a Subaru. So you've got one cylinder here and second cylinder here. So just 2 cylinders on that engine. This one happens to be an overhead cam, single overhead cam on this one, but most Subarus now, or many of them, are dual overhead cam engines. Beautiful aluminum head there, showing the springs and retainers with the cam. And obviously this is going to cover the top of the cylinders and form the upper side of the combustion chamber, and we'll see if that next one shows that. So combustion is going to occur in this combustion chamber here. Okay, these are the combustion chambers here and here. You can see that's where the spark plug comes through in the center. So in a sense, this is kind of a hemispherical design because you've got the spark plug up there in the center of the cylinder. It's not a true hemi, it's not 100% round, but the valves are canted in from 2 sides, so it's very similar to a hemispherical design. So here's an old school wedge engine with 2 valves per cylinder, a larger intake valve, of course, and a smaller exhaust valve, and then there's the spark plug off to the side. And that's everything that was pushrod engine up until, again, domestic up until the late 80s pretty much, unless it was a Chevy truck or Suburban, and they kept them even longer than that, okay? So in this picture, let's look at cylinder head parts. First, we've got the intake ports over here. And those intake ports are pretty square in shape. And then down here, you've got the exhaust. But it says we're going to route air or air and fuel into the combustion chamber. So air only on a diesel or a GDI, gasoline direct injected. And then the fuel will be sprayed into the combustion chamber. Or air and fuel on an indirect cylinder head. So here's the exhaust ports where the exhaust is coming out. By the way, these are 2 racing engines or high performance engines. One of the ways I can tell is that the wall of the intake port has been polished with, or not polished, but has been ground on with what we call a cartridge roll. It's a sandpaper roll. And it's evened it up, but it's not what we call polished. It's just sort of smoothed it out. But the exhaust is highly polished. We like this to give us a little bit of turbulent flow, a little bit of turbulence as air and fuel is going in, so it tends to mix, keep the air and fuel mixed. So next is valve guides. And we've got kind of a strange cylinder head here because you'll notice that the combustion chamber the cylinder head's completely flat, so it doesn't even look like it has a combustion chamber. This is actually a diesel engine, which is kind of a fun one to show. The piston would have a big giant dish on it. And with that dish would essentially be the combustion chamber. We've got 2 intake valves, 2 exhaust valves. That guide is in there. This guide is out, okay? And so the valve guides are tubes that are pressed into the cylinder head like it says. in order for us, and here's a cast iron one right here, in order for us to have something to guide the cylinder, or sorry, to guide the valve as it moves up and down and make sure it sits down on the valve seat correctly. We always want the valve to sit concentrically on the valve seat, and the reason for that is if we don't seal compression and the valve doesn't get cooled. So the inside diameter of that valve guide is very, very important to make sure the clearances are correct, which should be about a 1 to 2 thousandths clearance between the valve stem right here, the outside diameter of the valve stem, and the inside diameter of that guide. Needs to be about 1 to 2 thousandths, so there's a little room for oil to get in there. Okay, so next is the valve seats. So the valve seats are that place in the cylinder head where the valve face contacts. They've got some blue on there so you can see it. And so that is where the valve face is going to seal compression and to get cooled. What you've got in this picture is a number of seat inserts. So if you've got an aluminum cylinder head, we're going to have to put a hardened seat insert in. We can't have the valve sit right down on the aluminum. If it's a cast iron head, which this one appears to be, we can actually machine the valve seat right into the cast iron cylinder head, but then they will flame treat it, so it'll actually harden the area where the seat is. If you didn't do that, the valve would beat into the cylinder head pretty dramatically and pretty quickly, at least on the exhaust side. Okay. So here's a picture showing a valve in blue, the seat in yellow, and then gray is a cutaway of the cylinder head. And it just says when the valve is closed, it seals against the valve seat. I think you know that. Almost 100% of valves have a 45-degree face angle and a 45-degree seat angle so that they will contact. This picture is kind of nice because it lists all the parts of the valve, the head of the valve, the face is the 45-degree angle, the margin is this thickness from the end to the beginning of the face, the seat, the guide, the cylinder head, etc. So here is an old school valve train, picture of old school valve train components. We're talking about a push rod engine. Okay, so we've got cam down the block, lifters, push rods, rockers, and so on. That's a 2 valve per cylinder. So again, you can tell it's an older engine, but those valve train components are all the components that are involved in opening the valves and closing them, by the way. So here you're just showing, the only thing these pictures are showing is when the lobe tip hits the lifter, pushes the valve down, opens the valve. When it's off cam, the lobe's off of the lifter, obviously the valve is closed, or I'm sorry, yeah, it's closed, causing it to cool and also causing it to seal compression. By the way, we call this the heel of the cam, so when the backside gets here, we're perfectly opposite. That would be the place where we'd want to adjust valves if it had a valve adjustment. Here's number 12 would be overhead cam valve train operation. And here you're seeing a camshaft lobe coming around and hitting on this follower, this cam follower, or some of us call it a cam bucket, which pushes down on the tip of the valve. The spring is locked in there with those blue keepers, and they're showing a seal there to limit how much oil goes in, but they're not showing all the components, just showing you some of them. So next, here's a camshaft, and this one in particular is not from an overhead cam. This one happens to be in the block, and I can tell that because this thrust plate is used to keep the cam from walking out of the front of the engine, and that would be true. Ford did that, and not just Ford, but other manufacturers. Yeah, and so it says located in the block with the cylinder head. And this one in particular is located in the block. These are the cam journals. Here I see 3 of them for sure. I see cam lobes here. They've got an eccentric. I see a gear and a gear here. These 2 would be for, one might be for driving the distributor, one might be for driving an oil pump. So let's talk a little bit more about camshaft parts. So the cam lobes, and I'm sorry that it's not super clearly focused, and I can't necessarily fix that because it wants to focus on what it wants to focus on. But the cam lobes are egg-shaped protrusions on the cam, so it's an eccentric, and there's one for each valve, okay? And we've got a fuel pump eccentric. Some camshafts actually have what's called a fuel pump eccentric. So this big block Chevy camshaft has a gear here to drive the distributor. Then it has different lobes for valves. It has a journal for supporting it. 4 more valves, another journal. 4 more valves, another journal. 4 more valves. And then you've got this eccentric down here, this one right here. And it's, let me see if I can get it a little bit clearer. So you can hopefully see that eccentric, it is an eccentric, but it's not as pointy as the valve ones are. And this one comes around on old school camshaft driven fuel pumps, and drives the fuel pump, not the oil pump. And then the cam journals, you know, are these large machine surfaces. Actually, sorry, here it is right here, to support it on cam bearings in the block, or if it's an overhead cam engine, it's not supported with bearings. It just rides right on the aluminum of the cylinder head. So here's a valve lifter. So valve lifters are going to ride on the cam lobes to transfer motion to push rods or to rockers, depending on the type. Here would be like a small block Chevy roller hydraulic cam, where the roller here follows the profile of the camshaft, and they link 2 of them together to keep them from popping out or spinning, actually. So this doesn't spin sideways and destroy the cam. This one would be for an overhead camshaft. Believe it or not, what they have is they have a rocker that follows the cam lobe and pushes down on this, and the other side of it pushes down on the valve. So this is exactly what this looks like here. So this guy here has this guy here, and this roller right here is going to follow the cam profile, and then as it's following the cam profile, it's going to go like this and open the valve. The valve would be sitting right here on this side. Hopefully that makes sense to you. Okay. Purpose of a hydraulic lifter is to cushion the opening and closing of the valve. So it's located in the engine block or the cylinder head, and they're machine holes in the locker head. So they ride on the cam lobes and they do transfer motion, but we actually put pressurized oil in here to take up the clearance because it makes them quieter. Okay, makes them quieter. So push rods. Push rods are only on OHV engines or overhead valve engines. We don't use a roller lifter like this and a push rod like this or a rocker like this on an overhead cam. We're going to transfer motion from the lifters to the rocker arms, as you can see there in that picture. They're made from hollow metal tubes with a ball or socket formed in each end. So most of them are hollow so oil can go up through. That's not always true. Some are solid, but this one in the picture happens to be hollow for oil to come up through and go through a hole in the rocker and lubricate this pivot and lubricate the top of the valve and lubricate the stem. Okay, and yeah, there you go. So here's rocker arms, which is going to, like it says there, is going to cause the movement from the camshaft to open the valve. So in this case, there's a push rod pushing up, actuating that rocker, pushing down the valve. Here's one of these overhead cam lifter ones that I was just showing you. So this lifter follower, or this follower, sorry, lobe hits the follower, it pushes down on the valve and it pivots off a lifter on the other side. And it says valve spring closes the valve and keeps the rocker arm in contact with the push rod. At least that would be true over there. But a valve spring pushes up and keeps this follower in contact with the cam right there. So here's a picture of valves that are going to open and close the ports in the cylinder head, either to let air and fuel in or to let exhaust out. A couple of differences here. This intake valve here, you can see the head is much larger than the exhaust valve. But there's the margin. That thickness there is super critical for dissipating heat. There's the 45-degree face. We call this the fillet radius. There's the stem. These are keeper grooves. This is a single keeper groove. There's a multi-keeper groove there. And then the tip of the valves. And so obviously the larger head is the intake valve. So here's an intake valve compared to an exhaust valve. And we're going to control the air-fuel mixture or air into the combustion chamber. Air fuel if it's an indirect injected, air if it's a direct injected engine. Okay. The exhaust valves, of course, are going to allow the flow of exhaust gases out of the cylinders. And you've got some pictures of some exhaust valves there. And those valves have already been machined, so they're nice and polished there on the faces. And the head of them, which is the round parts of the head, are smaller than the intake valve. So for example, here's the head of an intake valve here and an exhaust valve here, and you can see the difference in head diameter. Okay. So next is valve seals. Valve seals. So in this picture here, this rubber seal, it's called an umbrella seal, is controlling the amount of oil that goes down through that stem between the stem and the guide. This small block Chevy also uses this rubber O-ring seal to seal against the bottom of the retainer, which also helps to reduce the amount of oil that gets on the stem. So it helps to control the oil getting by the guide into the combustion chamber, because we don't want any. Here's a picture of showing oil getting down through and getting through like this, which we really don't want. Here's the stem here. We do want just a little tiny bit of oil vapor. If it's a cast iron guide, cast iron at a molecular level has pores that can hold oil, so it's kind of self-lubricating in that sense. We call it self-lubricating because it tends to hold oil, but it can be tight enough that it's not really going to let oil go through it, and we don't burn oil as we're driving down the road. So those are valve stem seals. And here's the spring, which is used to close the valve. A spring in conjunction with a retainer and two tapered keepers lock the spring to the shield and to the retainer, so that spring doesn't go flying off, so it stays together. So a valve spring is going to be used to close the valve. Oh, by the way, in this picture, this would be a Chevy, and we can tell because that O-ring seal is the only engine that out there that I've ever seen that uses an O-ring type seal. And I know you may be thinking, Mr. L, what do you think, you know everything? No, it's not that I know everything. It's just that I worked in a machine shop for 4 years. And when you build a couple engines a day for 4 years, you see a lot of stuff. Okay. Intake manifold. Air and fuel are routed through these runners into each cylinder. So here you've got a plastic intake on that BMW, I believe. Yeah, it's BMW. And then this aluminum intake here. They're just tubes, and we call this the plenum, the common area of the intake manifold, and these are the runners. And we're just going to deliver air and fuel through those runners to each cylinder. So again, they can be aluminum, they can be plastic, and in old school days, like with small block Chevys, they were cast iron. Okay. So an exhaust manifold is going to carry burned gases from the ports down to the exhaust system, first for quieting down in a muffler, or sorry, first for treating in a catalytic converter, and then second for quieting in a muffler. The one on the left is a custom, what we call exhaust header, where you have individual runners going a long way down. This one happens to have a turbo on it, and so we call that an exhaust header. This would be just a regular pig iron manifold. They call it pig iron because it's a real cheap type of iron they use, and everything just kind of goes into one common tube and down. This would be this is better for torque. This is better for probably for torque and especially horsepower. They can be cast iron or they can be stainless, but we can't use aluminum because it's just not. They just don't stand up enough to the exhaust temperatures that we see. So next is our rocker arm cover, and that's going to keep our it's going to keep our dirt and water, etc., out of the engine. They can be steel or aluminum or plastic these days. We like the aluminum ones. They're much more rigid. They tend not to leak. The plastic ones tend to move around. The steel ones tend to move around. So most everybody's gone to aluminum valve covers or rocker covers. That Honda VTEC is aluminum, etc. So we're going to keep oil in the engine. We're going to keep dust and dirt out of the engine. Next, on manifolds, there's a picture of an intake manifold showing air and fuel going by the throttle plates and going in like this. Actually air, and then right here is an injector that's going to spray fuel by the intake valve, and then seeing the exhaust going out there. So let's talk about the top, the front end of an engine. So the front end components operate the cam, potentially, oil pump, or they not operate, but they include, we would say operate the cam if we're talking about the crank and a chain driving the cam. So we're going to operate the cam. We're going to rotate the oil pump, distributor, engine sensors, and a diesel injection pump. Those are all of the parts that might be driven by the engine front end components. So we have some sort of drive mechanism, a front cover, an oil seal, and a crankshaft damper. So here we go. Our drive mechanism on this one is a cam gear and a crank gear. There's our front cover. That one happens to be steel to keep oil in and dirt and dust out. And then there's a front seal here that's going to keep oil from coming out of the front of the engine and sealing to the front, of the crankshaft there. And then this really looks more like a pulley, but a harmonic balancer should be up here to dampen out harmonic and torsional vibrations in the engine. So different types of cam drives. We're going to drive the cam at 1/2 engine speed. So the crank gear is half the size of the cam gear, so this spins twice for every 1 turn here. And you can see the difference in size between this crankshaft and these camshafts. We're going to call the drive mechanism either a timing belt like here, or timing gears and chain like here. And so I've got 2 different types of chains here. This one's called a link belt chain, and this one's called a double roller. This looks like your bicycle chain, but twice as wide. Just 2 different styles. Here's a cam gear for a double roller, and here's a cam gear for a timing belt. And I do have a couple of broken timing belts here as well. People didn't believe that they actually had to change those things. So here's some camshaft drives showing a belt here, showing a chain drive here, and showing a gear-to-gear drive here. So it gives you an idea of how we can drive camshafts. Next is the front cover or timing cover. That one happens to be a steel one with an oil seal to seal around the snout of the crankshaft. And it says hold oil to seal front of crankshaft. So we're going to, again, keep oil in, and we're going to keep dirt and water and such out. Timing belt in this case is showing a timing belt being driven by the crank at the bottom here and driving the cam at the top. This one has a plastic cover on it because we don't have to seal oil in, just keep dirt and water out. Here's a timing chain. We've cut this away so you can see a chain driving the cranks driving the cam. This one has to be sealed because we've got oil in there. We need to lubricate those parts. Next is the crank damper or harmonic balancer. So this heavy wheel on the front of the engine is 2-piece. It has a hub with a rubber seal and an external hubs. Center hub, rubber seal, external hub. And these are going to be able to dampen out torsional and harmonic vibrations. So it says helps prevent crankshaft vibration and damage. You'll see them called crank damper or harmonic balancer. Okay, also called harmonic balancer or vibration damper. There you go, right there. So every engine has one. So here's one for a small block Chevy, and hopefully you can see the inner wheel, the rubber seal, and the outer wheel. And every once in a while they do slip, meaning the outside will slip in relation to the inside, and that will cause us some problems, but we won't go into it right now. And that's it. So there you go for upper end components.